Hello, everyone that's joined. We still have quite a few people joining at the moment, so we're going to wait a minute to start. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We'll just wait one more minute, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we can go ahead. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's information session hosted by CIET on behalf of the ISO's Save on Energy initiative. My name is Peter Lemoine, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And before we dive into the content, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. First of all, please ensure that your microphone is muted unless you're speaking. Second, the session is scheduled to last an hour. Third, we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation for any questions you may have, and we'll stop briefly in the middle to address any questions that directly pertain to slides being presented, and there'll also be an opportunity at the end. Any other questions can be referred to the ISO at trainingandsupport@iso.ca, and I'll put that email into the chat. The slides used in today's presentation will be shared with all attendees after the session. And please also note that the session is being recorded. The recording will be made available to all participants afterwards for reference. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter. We have Alyssa Williamson here to lead today's information session on understanding electricity rates in Ontario. Alyssa is an experienced energy management professional with over 15 years of energy and carbon management project experience focused in industrial settings. She is well-versed in guiding large power users through the implementation and design of demand-side management initiatives. So welcome, Alyssa, and with that, I turn it over to you to take us through the session.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Nice to have so many people online this morning. A lot of familiar faces, so hello to everyone. So the content of this webinar is aimed at providing participants with a foundational understanding of Ontario electricity rates, including wholesale, time of use, and tiered pricing. Before we get into those details, we're going to briefly go through the difference between energy and demand. We're going to talk about the key players in the electricity sector as well as their roles. And we're also going to take a peek at an average day in the market, which will help us further understand, how electricity rates are determined, and more importantly, help us understand how they could change down the road. We're then going to discuss the HOEP, or the Hourly Ontario Energy Price, and what it is, the global adjustment and its components, as well as the difference between a Class A and a Class B consumer. We're also going to take a look at the Industrial Conservation Initiative, otherwise known as the ICI, and how participating can impact consumer electricity pricing. Further to this series, there will be a separate and follow-up session on carbon pricing in the Ontario industrial market, which will be held on September 26th. And a third session in the series on how to create an energy budget will come later on in November. So for more information on these and other upcoming events, we're going to drop the link to the training and support event calendar in the comments, which can be found at saveonenergytraining.ca. So, key to understanding how energy rates are applied to different rate classes is differentiating between energy and demand. And this is going to come up a lot in the remainder of the presentation. So, energy is typically measured in kilowatt hours or megawatt hours if you're looking at a large facility, and refers to the total amount of energy used over a period of time. Demand, on the other hand, refers to the amount of power consumed at a point in time and is measured typically in kilowatts, or again, if you're a large power user, in megawatts. And a helpful way to think of demand is like the speed at which you're traveling, while energy is similar to the total distance traveled. So in the diagram, you can see the highest point in demand, otherwise referred to as the peak demand, across the day was roughly 22,000 kilowatts or 22 megawatts, while the area under the line would refer to the total amount of energy used. In this case, across the day, with the numbers across the x-axis referring to the given hour of the day. To better understand electricity rates, we'll start by briefly looking at the Ontario electricity sector and the players involved. We'll start with the Ministry of Energy and Electrification and the Ontario Energy Board, otherwise known as the OEB, and their roles. We'll discuss the Independent Electricity System Operator, otherwise known as the IESO. We'll talk about generators, transmitters, the local distribution companies, or LDCs, and retailers and their roles in the market. And this is intended to provide a bigger picture of how rates are determined. In this photo, you'll also notice that industrial customers and consumers are separated. And part of the reason for this is that many power users are what we call transmission connected and have the ability to interact differently with the grid, whether it's through demand response type programs or as an industrial conservation initiative program participant. These programs provide large power users the opportunity to get paid or avoid electricity charges by curtailing their use of power during certain periods. While we won't be going into demand response programs today, the latter half of this presentation will focus on different rate structures that can apply to electricity consumers, including at a high level, those that apply to large power consumers. Okay, so let's talk about the roles of key players. So we mentioned the Ministry of Energy and Electrification. Their role is to set energy sector policy through regulation and law. The Ontario Energy Board, or OEB, regulates the Ontario energy sector in the public's interest. And this is both for electricity and natural gas. And they do this through licensing of generation and transmission companies, utilities, energy retailers, and the IESO. They're also responsible for review and setting of transmission and delivery rates, and the creation and enforcement of rules and standards, along with the imposition of penalties and fines. They also look after consumer awareness and protection. And it's for this reason that a lot of the content from these slides in this webinar have come from the OEB. They are a great place to look for further information or to take a little bit of a deeper dive. So next is the IESO, or Independent Electricity System Operator. I like to think of them as the air traffic controller of the electricity system. They're a not-for-profit corporation established in 1998 by the Electricity Act. And their role is to manage the electricity flow by balancing supply and demand and directing power users across Ontario. They connect key players, including generators, transmission networks, local utilities, and industrial users. The ISO plans for the future to ensure long-term electricity availability, and they also oversee conservation by coordinating energy-saving efforts across the province. So what is the ISO not? They do not own electricity infrastructure or generation, and they do not buy or sell electricity. In this slide, you can see a view of the ISO control room. Control room operators, as shown here, are constantly monitoring the flow of electricity by balancing the flow of supply and demand. They are liaisons between generators and transmission companies, all the while planning for different scenarios such as peak demand periods and potential system constraints. Next, let's talk about the role of generators. So, as it sounds, generators produce electricity. They can be public, or in the case of the Ontario Power Generation, or OPG, provincially owned. Interestingly, OPG generates about half the electricity in Ontario, and unlike private generators who determine their cost to produce power, OPG's cost to produce is regulated by the Ontario Energy Board. And as you can see in the figure on the right-hand side, which came from the OEB's website, it provides an overview of the Ontario system-wide electricity supply mix. Over half the system-wide electricity supply in 2023 came from nuclear, while hydro or water power supply roughly represented a quarter of all electricity. These two types of generation are typically referred to as our baseload fleet. Wind, solar, bioenergy, they supplied about 21% of the province's electricity in total, while the remaining roughly 9% came from our peaking resources, which are otherwise known as our natural gas fleet. Next, let's talk about transmitters, distributors, and retailers. So transmitters refer to market participants who own the high voltage equipment that makes up the IESO controlled grid. They do not buy or sell energy, but rather connect generators and large power consumers. They are compensated through transmission charges, and a good example of a transmitter would be Hydro One. Distributors, on the other hand, move electricity across low voltage lines that deliver it to consumers. So low voltage being less than 50 kV, with anything above that being considered high voltage and transmission. So our LDCs, also known as local distribution companies, supply about 95% of Ontarians with electricity. Retailers, their role is to resell electricity rather than producing it themselves. They can act as importers or exporters. And if you buy electricity from a retailer, you pay the price you agreed to in the contract. So far, we've talked about the difference between energy and demand and introduced the key players in the Ontario electricity sector, as well as their roles in the market. Next, we're going to look at a very simplified version of what a typical day in the market looks like. So as mentioned, this is a very simplified overview of the electricity market, but at a high level, this will help us understand when we're discussing rates and components, kind of how they are determined. So a typical day in the market starts with suppliers or generators submitting offers and bids to provide electricity. The IESO then accepts offers until demand is met, starting with the lowest priced options first. This process leads to the setting of what's called, again, the hourly Ontario electricity price, or HOEP, which is one part of the commodity price of electricity. LDCs then resell and distribute electricity to customers. The IESO then receives settlement payments from large customers and LDCs and transfers these payments to generators. So as mentioned in this webinar, we're not going to be diving into a lot of topics into detail. One of these topics that we won't be talking about today is market renewal, which is expected to go live in Q2 of 2025. Market renewal refers to an update in how the market will change in setting the HOEP and supply pricing. So essentially, it's going to move to a two-schedule market, from a two-schedule market to a single-schedule market. So if you're interested in learning anything more about market renewal and exactly what it means and how it impacts you, there's a lot of information and training materials available on the ISO's website. And the link to this information is provided at the end in the appendices, which everyone will have a copy of after. And I just saw a quick question come up in the chat that I think is timely, so I'll just respond to that right now. The question was, will market renewal impact pricing? And yes, ultimately it will. It's going to change the way that pricing is set. It's still kind of relevant to understand how it's set today, in that it'll help everyone understand how it's set down the road. And as I mentioned, that's way into the weeds and not what we're going to be talking about today. But there is a lot of information to come, and what is important in this webinar is to understand that it's coming, so that you can be further informed outside of this presentation on exactly what's going to happen. Okay, so next let's get into rate components. So on this slide, you'll see kind of 4 of the main types of rate components. So we have energy, which again is typically measured in kilowatt hours. This is the commodity charge, including the HOEP and Class B global adjustment. We have demand in kilowatts. So for Class A customers, this includes the global adjustment. We have what's called service charges or customer charges. This could include uplift, administration, and we have transmission and I'll just remind everybody to keep yourselves on mute. And we have transmission and delivery charges, which include network, connection, and line and transformation charges. So depending on the type of customer, and we're going to talk about Class A and Class B customers later in the presentation, and the type of rate plan the customer chooses, they could see some, all, or a combination of the charges above. In the figure on the right, you'll see the total electricity rate from 2011 to 2021 provided in cents per kilowatt hour. You can see that this is further broken down by the HOEP component, which is shown in blue, and the average GA, which is shown in yellow. I would say the remaining charges are so minimal in comparison to these 2 components that they don't even show up in this graph. Some of the highlights, though, from this graph is that in general, the trend in total rates increased gradually all the way up until 2021, where you can see it drop down to more around 2015 levels. And I'll just highlight this. This shows the impact of the government's update to rates, where they took a large portion of the GA out of the rate base and moved it to the tax base. So it looks like rates dropped. It just got moved from kind of one spot to another. The next thing that this graph kind of highlights is that the HOEP and GA are inversely related to each other. So essentially, when GA increases, the HOEP decreases and vice versa. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about a little bit in more detail about why that happens. But first, we're going to dive into these charges into a little bit more detail, as understanding them helps support you in the type of forecasting or budgeting you're looking to do. All right, so let's look at the HOEP first. So what is it? It's the hourly wholesale cost to acquire electricity. And who pays it? Well, everyone pays it. So whether you understand it or not, or see it as a separate line item, everyone's paying it, including residential customers. So for residential or small business rate classes, otherwise known as Class Bs, the HOEP is included in the time of use or tiered rates that you see on your bills that are set through the OEB. For medium and large businesses, so those with a monthly peak demand of more than 50 kilowatts, the HOEP is a separate line item. So for those customers, you might be a little bit more used to seeing that on your bill. Now, we don't want to go too far into the details here, but essentially how it works is the ISO contracts electricity from generators for each 5-minute increment, with each increment receiving what's called a market clearing price, or MCP. The weighted average of these 12 market clearing prices for each hour make up the HOEP for that hour. So in short, the HOEP is the actual cost to produce electricity for that hour, and funds collected from this charge type flow from customers to generators. And you'll see on the screen, this is a screenshot from the ISO's website. And you can see this data in real time by going to ieso.ca/power-data. And I think Peter's going to throw this into the chat for anyone if you are interested. You'll see these details on the slide are from August 7th to 13th of this year. The HOEP is shown in red. The 5-minute market clearing price is shown in black, and the projected HOEP in dotted red. And the other item shown on this chart is the Ontario demand, which is in green, and the amount of power required in the province. So the biggest takeaway from this slide is that generally speaking, the market clearing price and the resulting HOEP are more likely to increase when the demand for electricity is high. And this is an important concept to understand. So this is because generation offers are accepted in order of the lowest price until demand is met, with the lowest cost resources being contracted first, and then the last resource required to meet demand, setting the price per unit of energy. So effectively setting the price that all generators receive for that hour. When demand increases, this results in more supply being required to meet the market demand, thus resulting in higher price generation offers being accepted and a higher HOEP. So this is, the market is complex, and this is, of course, a very simplified version of why HOEP fluctuates through the day. There's certainly many other factors that influence the HOEP, and some of which we'll talk about now. Some of the bigger ones and kind of more obvious ones are the cost of natural gas. And this is because the price for natural gas powered generators is directly impacted by the cost of the fuel that they're burning. Another factor that influences the HOEP are maintenance outages, and in particular for low-cost resources. So think, nuclear refurbishments. And the reason that this is that it can mean more expensive resources will be required in order to meet demand. So when our low-cost resources are on outage or unavailable, then the province requires more high-cost resources to fill that typical demand. So that does have an impact. Another influence to the HOEP is weather. And this can be, as a result of less wind or less solar, can mean more higher cost resources are required. So sun isn't shining, wind isn't blowing. We need to supplement that generation elsewhere. So as mentioned, the list of factors that may influence the HOEP are by no means comprehensive. It does provide a few examples of, why rates can increase. And so with that, we are almost halfway through the presentation. So Peter, maybe I'll just ask you this. Seems like it could be a good place to stop for questions before we kind of get into the GA. Do we have any questions that we wanted to go through?
The two that have been asked so far have already been addressed. Megan provided one response to a question in the chat, and you addressed the other. Are there any other questions from attendees on the content that Alyssa has thus far presented? We'll also have a little bit of time at the end.
Okay, perfect. So we will then continue. All right, so next let's talk about the global adjustment. Okay, so like the HOEP, all customers pay the global adjustment. And the global adjustment components can include, well, it includes the cost of many things, but mainly it includes the cost of the construction of new electricity infrastructure and, the maintenance and refurbishment of existing generation. Included also in the GA is the difference between market revenue and the contractual revenue defined under generation contracts, and also the cost to deliver conservation programs. So the second point that I just mentioned, this point explains the inverse relationship between HOEP and GA. So typically, there's a minimum monthly contractual revenue amount provided under generation contracts, essentially to make generators whole. And so if, for example, the price of gas for that month is low and a generator doesn't reach their minimum revenue for the month, the difference for the minimum month guaranteed in their contract is provided under the GA. The ISO, I'll just point out to the right-hand side of the slide here. This is a screenshot from the ISO's website of the monthly GA for the beginning of this year, and broken out into some of the different types of contracts. So the ISO publishes these monthly GA values on their website. And this shows the biggest breakdown from the largest components. So this includes the amount from OPG nuclear and hydroelectric generation stations, as well as contracts formally made with the Ontario Power Authority. But really the key number I want to draw you to is the total GA for the month. So this total that we saw in the slide previous, it's then broken down into Class A and Class B totals, which we're going to talk about those. And these totals are the numbers used to charge customers based on their respective rate class. So in the next few slides, we'll go over how each rate structure is applied, but in general terms, the difference is that Class A customers are charged based on their demand, so in kilowatts, while Class B customers are charged based on their consumption, or energy in kilowatt hours. So if you look at, again, the screenshot from the ISO's website, which you can see the source is linked on the screen there, the total Class A amount on the first row there, you'll see is anywhere from 86 million to 130 million. So this value fluctuates monthly, which means that for certain rate classes, their global adjustment component fluctuates monthly, not only based on how much power they use, but also based on what the GA for that month was. So let's talk about Class A customers. So what is a Class A customer? Well, these types of customers have an average annual peak demand of greater than 500 kilowatts, or 0.5 megawatts. They are Industrial Conservation Initiative participants, and they have a separate line item for energy and demand charges. So they see the HOEP as a separate line item on their invoice, and they pay their share of GA through their what's called their peak demand factor, or PDF, which is their percentage contribution of energy withdrawn from the grid during their top 5 peak hours. And I'll explain that point a little bit further in a second. So Class A customers have to opt in. So they're not automatically in as a Class A customer. Those eligible to become Class A customers get sent what's called a notice of customer eligibility. And if they're invoice through the ISO, it comes directly from the ISO. If they get their invoices through an LDC or a local distribution company, then this notice of eligibility is sent through them. And this is typically sent out, not typically, it's always sent out by May 31st as required by regulation. And the deadline to opt in to become a Class A customer for the next baseline period is must be given by June 15th. So I just want to highlight a couple key points on this. In one of the first slides, we talked about the key players, and we mentioned, large power consumers kind of on their own. These are typically Class A customers. They usually get their electricity invoices directly from the ISO, and these are the customers that have the option to either qualify as a Class A customer or remain as a Class B customer. So just want to elaborate for a second on the PDF, or peak demand factor. This value is calculated by summing the consumer's demand during the top 5 Ontario peak demand hours for the year, and dividing this value by the total Ontario demand during the same 5 hours. So this typically results in a low decimal value of up to 6 decimal places. So this PDF number could look like something like 0.000500. It's typically a very small number. The customer's monthly GA charges that they are charged come from the monthly GA we saw in the previous slide in the $1 million amounts times this PDF value. So to give everyone an idea of, or an example of how this would work out for a large power consumer. So for a large power consumer with, say, a $1 million per month electricity bill, the GA can make up as much as $800,000 of that for that one line item. So that gives you an indication of the value of the ICI program and how the ability to reduce the amount of GA paid could be very valuable to a large power consumer. And we talked about the threshold being 0.5 megawatts of average annual peak demand for people who are customers who would be eligible. A customer who is on the smaller side of the Class A threshold could see a much, much smaller invoice than this. So, $10,000 a month. So at a very high level, and we won't get into all the details of why, but essentially one of the benefits of being a Class A customer is having the flexibility to reduce their monthly electricity costs by taking actions during peak demand periods. So those hours that count in setting their PDF, customers are able to take action during those periods by either curtailing their usage or offsetting their load using things like batteries. Okay, so that was Class A customers. Next, we're going to talk about everybody else, so the Class B customers. And Class B customers can fall under one of two types. We have wholesale metered or retail contract customers, and then there's also the small business and residential customers. So the latter has the option of using tiered or time of use rates. And we will start and go into a little bit more detail on the wholesale metered or retail contract customers first. So these type of customers essentially are medium to large size power consumers who elect to pay the GA based on energy in kilowatt hours and not demand. So these can be the large power consumers that qualify to be Class A but choose not to be. On the right-hand side, you can see a snippet from an example of a bill, and you can see that they're charged a rate for their HOEP, and they have a separate line item for the rate for their global adjustment. And these customers pay each based on their total monthly supply. So the total amount of energy used for the month would be multiplied by each of these rates to get the line item charges. So we won't go into all the reasons why customers would want to be charged based on energy and not demand. But one example could be that they don't have flexibility to curtail their load during typical peak demand periods. So typically a peak demand period happens between, say, 6 and 9 p.m. So if a customer doesn't have the ability to curtail down there, that might make sense for them to be charged based on their energy consumption instead of their peak demand. Many customers, prior to deciding which rate class they'd like to belong to, run some calculations to see which options based on their usage would be less expensive for them. So if you're a large power user and you have not evaluated the difference between being a Class A or a Class B customer, or haven't done so recently, this could be a great opportunity to review your electricity costs and could provide you an opportunity to reduce them. Okay, so next we will talk about small business and residential Class B customers. So this is the one that you and I at home fall under. Again, all rates include HOEP and the global adjustment. For these ones, we don't see it because they're baked into the rate classes, which are set by the OEB. And one of the benefits of these rates is, our rates don't fluctuate, whereas, the Class A customers can fluctuate very substantially. So let's look at the different types. So as mentioned, there's tiered or time of use. So tiered provides two rates based on the total amount of electricity used. And this provides the flexibility to consumers to use electricity at any point in the day. So if you look on the right, and again, this came from the OEB's website, and I encourage anybody who is looking at their own electricity bill to take a look at this. I personally have looked at which rate class I should fall under. So again, the link on the slide can take you exactly to more information. But essentially for the tiered rates, so there's two different rates for residential customers, one that applies in the summer and one that applies in the winter. For the summer, the first tier, the lowest rate class is for usages less than 600 kilowatt hours, with anything above that falling under the higher rate class. For winter, they bump up this number a bit to 1,000 kilowatt hours. And, this obviously relates to home heating and, the amount of cold weather that we get in the winter. So they bump that up to about 1,000, not about, to exactly 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. So any usage below that being at the tier 1 rate, and usage above that being at the tier 2 rate. For small businesses, this threshold is 750 kilowatt hours throughout the entire year. So that was the tiered rate. Another option available to small business and residential customers is what's called time of use. So time of use provides 3 price periods. So there's one for off-peak usage, which is the lowest rate, followed by a mid-peak usage, and then an on-peak usage, which has the highest rates. So essentially the difference between when these periods apply is our off-peak usage and the lowest rates are provided to consumers on weekends and statutory holidays all year round. The lowest rates are also provided in the summer and the winter in the overnight period. So from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., we get the benefit of the lowest off-peak rate. So the difference really comes in summer and winter, and when the mid-peak period is and the on-peak period. So you can see in summer, The peak period is from 11 to 5. And this really corresponds, if you think about it, to the warmest time of the day. So in most of the province, the warmest time of the day is, across the midday period. And that's when most people are using their air conditioning for cooling. So this results in high peak periods, and thus the highest on-peak use rate applies then. On winter periods, you see that this peak period shifts to the morning and the evening periods, and this really corresponds to lighting, and people are getting ready for work in the morning and they're using a bunch of energy. Then they come home at 5 p.m. They um, you know, turn on the heat, they're turning on their ovens, and peak usage as a result happens during those periods. So um, that kind of gives you an idea of the on-peak, mid-peak, and off-peak rates and when they happen. And these change from May to October for the summer period, and then April to November is when the winter period applies. The last type of rate that we're going to talk about today is the ultra low overnight rates that were made available. And this essentially provides four price periods based on when consumers use power. And this one adds a ultra low overnight period from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And that is essentially when the grid has the lowest Ontario demand. So they've gone through and created a fourth rate, which is even lower. Again, weekends and statutory holidays, the weekend off peak rate applies. So it's the second lowest rate. And then weekday rates, so between 4 and 9 p.m., you have your on peak with the rest being a mid peak rate. So again, that was a very quick, high-level overview of all the different types of rates in the Ontario electricity sector. We gave you a brief overview of Class A participants and the type of rate structure they qualify for. We talked about Class B customers and the different types of Class B customers, along with residential and small business rates. So for more information on rate structures, I would refer you to either the IESO's website or the OEB, and there's a link to the OEB's website on the slide. Um, this, both resources have ample for follow-up material and information on all of these rate classes. So there's no shortage of explanations and resources available to you to cover that. We do have a couple of resources in our appendices that will go out to participants after the webinar. So I'll just mention them now. Sorry, I meant to be on this slide. So one of I would recommend two courses to those who are really looking at, invoice reconciliation or understanding more about Ontario's market. I took these courses myself, at the very beginning of, learning about electricity rates, and I found them so helpful. And these are available through the ISO. The first one is called Introduction to Ontario's Physical Markets, and it's really for those new to Ontario's competitive wholesale electricity market. So if you're looking at Class A bills, this was very helpful, and it takes some of the content from earlier in this webinar and really elaborates into more of the details. The second one is settlements and commercial reconciliation. So this one is, this really goes into the weeds. These courses, I suspect, will either be revamped or they may, be on hold until market renewal is complete. I wouldn't be surprised, as the current market is going to be changing, as I mentioned, in Q2 of next year. But Both of these are available on the ISO's website. Again, highly recommend them for learning more about these topics. And then as far as the market renewal program, because it is important and it is something that this webinar did not touch on at all, there will be a link in the presentation you get to more resources. And I suspect that there will be tons and tons of training available to everyone in the market once this comes into place. So with that, I'll just take this back to this slide here. And Peter, that is the end of our presentation for today. I think it would be a good opportunity to go through some questions. Do we have anything in the chat right now?
Yeah, we have a few questions that I noted. There was a question from Robert with regards to the hourly energy price versus the GA charge. And the question is the hourly energy charge typically higher than the GA charge?
That's a good question. Okay, so we'll just go back to this slide here. So no, so if you look back in different years, the HOEP and GA have fluctuated depending on the year and the makeup. And the key part to this is that they're inversely related. So when one's high, the other's low, and vice versa. Typically for a Class A customer, the global adjustment can make up, upwards of 80% of consumer's bill. And obviously this kind of depends on whether or not they're, shedding load during peak periods or trying to do certain actions to reduce their peak demand factor. But no, typically for a Class A customer anyways, the GA is a bigger chunk. But if you're talking about a consumer who has made substantial actions or curtailed their load during all 5 peaks, that number their cost for global adjustment could effectively be zero if they're not using electricity during those periods. So I would say the answer to your question is it depends on each customer. But typically, yeah, if somebody's not taking action, the GA can be larger.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa, for that response. We also have a question from Azibola. Do Class A customers only get charged for the hourly energy price, and do they have an option for tiered rates?
Okay, so good question. So let's go back to this slide. So a large power consumer can either be a Class A or a Class B. If they choose to be a Class A, then this slide here pertains to them, and they pay the global adjustment based on their peak demand factor. If they are a Class B customer, then as I mentioned, there's 2 categories. There's the wholesale metered or retail contract customers, or small business and residential. So if a large power consumer doesn't want to be a Class A customer, then they qualify as a wholesale metered customer, in which case, no, they don't have the option to do the tiered rate or the time of use. They pay their share of the GA, and they are charged based on their total kilowatt hours used for the month. So there will be a separate charge for global adjustment, and there will be a separate rate for the HOEP. And say they use 10 kilowatt hours for the month. Each of those rates is multiplied by their 10 kilowatt hours, and that's their bill. So the tiered rates that you're asking about, the tiered and the time of use, those are only available to small businesses and residential customers. So, you first have to see as a consumer, what do you fall under? And then there's different options available to you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Ali had a question about slide 17.
Okay, let's see.
And this goes to the difference between market revenue and contractual revenue. And can you explain how the difference between market revenue and contractual revenue might impact impacts the GA cost?
Yeah, okay. So, and this is kind of a tricky one to explain, but so good question. So market revenue here is referring to, so you have let's say we are a natural gas generation facility, and we we generate a lot of power that month, right? And in our contract, it says we're guaranteed to make $1 million a month, right? I'm completely pulling numbers out of the air. So as long as that generator makes that amount, that minimum value provided in their contract, then that's great, right? But say for whatever reason, they don't make that minimum value. In order to make that generator whole under their contract, and in order for them to make that minimum revenue that's guaranteed under their contract, they're then given the difference of what they made that month through generation. And that difference between the minimum amount in their contract and what they made through market revenue is given to them under the GA. So the GA pot pays them that minimum amount, and it really makes sure that all of our generators are remaining whole, and nobody is not making the minimum amount required for them to remain as generators. I hope that makes sense. It is a little bit complex, and that's probably the part of this presentation that kind of goes in a little bit to the weeds. But if you have any other questions, I would refer you to this link that's shown on the slide here, Global Adjustment Components and Costs. Excuse me. If you go to the ISO's website, I mean, I have to give them credit. If you put something into their search bar, it very effectively gets you to the right place. So if you even search global adjustment in their search bar under iso.ca, it will take you to kind of the details on this, which you could read way further into all of these details on your own, and it is very interesting. For some of us, anyways.
So I think maybe we have time for one more question. And Patrick had a question about wholesale markets, which is who participates in those? Is it LDCs and a small number of very large consumers?
Who participates in the wholesale market? LDCs and a small. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the exact answer to this one, Patrick. I'll be totally honest with you, but the way I like to think about it is that yes, LDCs and large power consumers who pay the ISO directly, they are participating in the wholesale market, and the ISO is kind of taking their payment and giving it directly to generators. So yeah, I would say that, from what I understand, your comment there is accurate.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have for questions today, Alyssa. So I think we can move on to closing the presentation.
Perfect. I'll bring you back to your slide here, Peter.
So we thank you, of course, for attending to today's session, and we invite you also to stay connected with different ISO tools and resources, which are listed here, including virtual one-on-one coaching, the monthly bulletin, the live training calendar, which I will now put directly into the chat, where you can sign up for future trainings, and as well as the training and support webpage. And we'll be providing this deck to everyone after the training, so you can get the direct links to all of these tools and resources. And we also invite you to celebrate the accomplishments and innovations of Ontario's energy leaders who are helping drive a more sustainable future at the Save on Energy 2024 Energy Management Excellence Awards. And I will also drop that link into the chat where you can register. And that brings us to a close of today's training. Thank you very much, Alyssa, for the insightful presentation, and thank you very much, attendees, for your attention and for your insightful questions. If you have additional questions that we did not get to today during the training, you can also drop the ISO and an email at training-and-support@iso.ca, which I've also put into the chat. So thanks again to everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.